It's probably no secret that recently I've been thinking a lot about the royal family, the British royal family. And yeah, a big part of this is watching The Crown. It's a superb series, very engaging. But with this interview with Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, on Oprah Winfrey, which is scheduled to be broadcast controversially by ITV tonight, it is timely to think about the whole saga of Charles and Diana. No, that subject has been exhaustively covered by the British press, and it'll never go away. It will always, always be uh, a dark point in some ways on this Queen's reign. Um, Even though I think she is a widely respected monarch, I think it will always be something that people look back to as the Diana story. Um, but I've long felt that there isn't really a balance in this perception in the public mind, and I appreciate that not everyone will agree with what I'm saying in this video. All I would ask is that you consider it, okay? And if you still disagree, that's fine. But um, basically, since 1997, the kind of the widespread public perception has been that Prince Charles, our future king, is the pantomime villain in the whole Diana saga. And I think that's a bit unfair. Now, before people respond to that in the comments or whatever it might be in your mind, um, hear me out. So let's look at the situation. When Charles and Diana married, Diana was very young, 20. Charles wasn't that old himself, but she was a lot younger than him, obviously. Um, that's an enormous pressure for a young woman to take to marry into the British royal family and to be in line to be the Queen Consort of the United Kingdom. Um, and in those days, tabloids were even more outrageous, arguably, than they are now. So there was media attention on her from the very beginning, and that didn't entirely subside when the two high-profile royal weddings of the 2010s happened, William and Kate and Harry and Meghan. It improved a bit, but there was still, that intensive press attention. Of course, Kate Middleton and Meghan Markle were a good bit older than Diana, and in that sense, I would argue more prepared. Um, Looking back, it's easy to see where a lot of this went wrong. I think that Charles probably didn't do enough to prepare her for that life, as a boyfriend and then as a husband. But when we look at the Charles Diana saga, it's easy to just dismiss it as all one terrible thing. It's easy to forget that actually in those early years, I think they were quite happy. Um, it's only later on that things started going badly. Of course, Charles was having an affair. That's well documented now. By definition, he wasn't a good husband. But if you look at the footage from that time, what you can see is two people who were unhappy. That's no excuse for what Charles done. It was wrong from the point of view of being a husband and wrong in terms of, he broke his marriage vows. Um, I'm sure the church didn't look kindly on it. But, you can see footage where both Diana and Charles were unhappy. So this isn't a case that Charles was just messing around. He was also unhappy. And that's not an excuse. It's just an observation. It's not like he was just a womanizer and he was messing around. He didn't love Diana at that point. Um, and this brings me to the issue of Camilla versus Diana because it's kind of become popular. If you look at videos of Camilla Parker Bowles, people always home in on her looks, which strikes me as pretty shallow. Um, like, how could Charles choose her over Diana? It's a very ad hominem attack. If you don't like Camilla's personality, fine. That's a point of critique, but I think to attack her looks is pretty shallow. And the fact of the matter is, Charles was in love with Camilla in a way he wasn't with Diana. And Anyone who's ever been in love knows what that is like. So looks should be irrelevant to it, frankly. I mean, that's the first thing. It's attacking her on her appearance is, I think, low. It's not legitimate criticism. Um, the other thing is, and this is really, in a sense, the elephant in the room. Princess Diana died young. Um, Lady Diana, as she then was, actually. Well, actually, I think she still had her princess title by 1997, but she died young in tragic circumstances, 36 years old, just a year older than myself. Um, and that was awful. It was a particularly horrific crash, and the behavior of the paparazzi was outrageous. I will say, though, the conspiracy theories are, there's minimal evidence to support them. The idea that the monarchy was somehow behind it. It is true that there are some question marks over that event. It's like any major news story, there's always going to be question marks over it, particularly at a time when there was no social media. Um, this was still a television age before social media really took off. So a lot of the information that we would have today on a news story just didn't exist in 1997. I mean, there's reports, for example, of a white Fiat or a white Citroen being seen in the vicinity that mysteriously vanished. I admit a lot of it's quite intriguing, even a bit creepy, some of the things that went on there. And the Ponte Alma tunnel, it definitely has an atmosphere about it. I've been to Paris twice, I haven't been there, but you can see from footage and so on, knowing what happened there. But I think when you look at the facts of the case, Henri Paul was heavily over the limit. The paparazzi were vigorously pursuing them. When you put all these things together, what you're left with is a tragic accident. Um, the idea that the Queen and Prince Charles were somehow involved, I think, is outrageous. And I think there's no evidence for it. But the circumstances of her death, in a sense, kind of ensured that Prince Charles will forever be cast as the pantomime villain. Because, and this might sound cold, but had she lived, I think that the public perception would be a little bit more balanced. A little bit more balanced. Um, it might well be that people would still say she was treated unfairly, but people forget that actually they both had an affair, and they might say, well, I don't blame Diana because of the way Charles was behaving, but they both had an affair. So, in that sense, Diana wasn't entirely innocent either. I'm not judging that. They were unhappy, but they both had an affair. Diana, of course, with Dodi Al Fayed. Um, but I do think, this always happens when someone dies young in tragic circumstances and they're already a popular figure. They're kind of marbleized and immortalized. That's what happened with Diana. So it's easy now for people to put her on this podium where, she's kind of an angel and she never done anything. She wasn't capable of any sort of wrong whatsoever. I would somewhat question that. I think Diana was a genuinely good person. She clearly had compassion for victims of landmines, for humanitarian causes. I think that was real. So I don't take that away from her. I think she was a good person fundamentally. However, take for example the press. The long-standing narrative is the press hounded her to death. The behavior of the paparazzi was outrageous, but the more mainstream press, um, and I feel there's some echoes of this with Meghan and Harry. The fact of the matter is, Diana did not always hate her fame. There were times that she enjoyed being famous. There were times that she utilized the press. And an example of this is that famous interview where she, in 1995 during the divorce, when she said there were three people in this marriage, and the reporter asked her, I don't know if it was the famous Martin Bashir interview or another one, but I'd like to be the Queen of Hearts. Now, you'd have to be pretty naive to think that wasn't a calculated statement. I think Diana was quite clever in that sense, and I think that was a jibe at the Queen. you know, where the Queen was this kind of matriarchal figure who did misjudge the mood of the nation with that whole thing. But I think that was a bit of a swipe at the Queen, and that's an example of where she could be quite assertive and quite, I don't want to say manipulative, that's too strong a word perhaps, but Diana wasn't stupid. Um, and she would say things like, "Oh, I'm not a political figure," and she was very, very skilled at garnering that sort of public sentiment, or kind of using the press to her advantage in that way. So, in that sense, this idea that she was just an innocent young woman who was just dragged through this whole thing with no choice and no say whatsoever isn't entirely true. She did enjoy her fame at times, and she did use the press at times, like all royals do, to promote causes and so on. And certainly Meghan and Harry have done that. Um, and I do believe, had she lived, I think that the public perception would be a little bit less idolatrous, for want of another word. People would still probably be sympathetic and say, I reckon she'd probably have a status similar to Sarah Ferguson. She'd be probably quite popular. She'd be engaging in charity causes, probably doing the occasional interview, and she'd be an outsider. Um, but I think people would also say, well, she had her time in the royal family. She was under a lot of pressure, and that's the way things turned out. But she knew what she was marrying into. Um, I mean, she was a young woman, but no one forced her to marry, ultimately. Um, it's not like Charles just, picked her out and said, "You are marrying me by royal decree. You have to do it." Um, I really do think in those early years they genuinely loved one another, but I think that Charles was a bad husband. There's no question about it. But I think it is unfair to just portray him as a pantomime villain. I mean, it's 9 years before he got married to Camilla Parker Bowles, and people sort of act like he doesn't deserve any happiness because of what happened to Diana. But I just think that this man will be a future king, and I think apart from being not a great husband, I quite like Charles. I think he's a decent man. I mean, he clearly has a lot of concern for young people. He's a modern man compared to his mother. Um, he's genuinely concerned about ecological issues. There's a lot of things to like about Charles, and I just think it's a little bit unfortunate that he's been kind of cast. Well, him and Camilla have been cast as the pantomime villains in this whole thing. And I say this whole thing because it will never go away, and it will no doubt emerge when he becomes king. Um, so summed up, I think it is very tragic and sad what happened to Princess Diana, and I think she was a remarkable person. Public support for her was very understandable. I would just ask people to be a little bit more balanced in their viewpoint on this, just portraying it as, oh, terrible, wicked Charles, the awful husband, poor innocent little Diana. I don't think it's that simple. I really don't. And that's all. So I appreciate not everyone will agree with this, but that's my stance.